Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in this hour as we discuss the 2030 jobs plan for the St. Louis region. I'm Hank Weber, Executive Vice Chancellor for Civic Affairs and Strategic Planning at Washington University. I'll be moderating today's panel discussion with four people who've been very engaged in the plan process: Jason Hall, Dedric Carter, Jenny Lodge, and Valerie Patton. But before we do that, I will turn the attention over to Mark Wrighton, the 14th, who will introduce Bruce Katz, the consultant who led the work on this plan. There will be an opportunity to ask questions of the panelist or Bruce or Mark, and if you can put your in the chat function, please. And there is a Q&A function where down at the bottom screen, along with chat, share screen, and record. And if you can put your questions in there, I will organize them. And we should have time at the end to do that. But let me begin with one of my favorite things to do, which is introduce my longtime boss and friend, Mark Wrighton, the 14th Chancellor of Washington University. Mark was the Chancellor from 1995 to 2019. During his 24-year tenure, the university made great strides in student quality, campus improvements, resource development, curriculum, and international reputation. Chancellor Wrighton also served as chair of the 2030 Jobs Plan, providing significant time and energy into its development. Mark, thank you for your many contributions, not just to Washington University, but to St. Louis. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Hank, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon to hear about the St. Louis 2030 Jobs Plan. Now it's a little more than a year since David Kemper and Tom Santel, on behalf of Civic Progress, contacted me about participating in planning the next 10 years for economic growth here in the St. Louis region. Our focus from the outset has been an effort to create high quality jobs and to bring about inclusive economic growth. This is an extremely important undertaking, perhaps made even more important by the challenges that we've experienced in connection with the pandemic. As you would likely know, Black-owned, brown-owned businesses have been devastated by the pandemic, and we in our community must do much more to bring about inclusive economic growth in our region. Our St. Louis 2030 Jobs Plan has focused on this agenda, and it has been, for me, a learning experience, and I've really enjoyed the opportunity to work with more than 100 people here in the St. Louis region. We have been focused on developing plans that can be implemented. And I'm very grateful that Jason Hall has been involved from the very outset. He is now the Chief Executive Officer of the newly formed Greater St. Louis Incorporated. That organization will be carrying the ball in terms of implementation as we look ahead. And I'm confident that with the unity that has been realized in connection with bringing together several economic development organizations under that one umbrella, we have an excellent prospect for inclusive economic growth over the next 10 years. During this pandemic, I've had a bit of time to scout what's going on in our community, going out for the occasional drive with my wife. From St. Charles to Southern Illinois to downtown St. Louis, I see many elements of momentum, but we need to add significantly to what's taking place. Just this morning, I drove by the National Geospatial Intelligence Development, North St. Louis. I drove by the soccer stadium that's under development nearby. I saw the redevelopment of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch building by Jim McKelvey and Square. There are many exciting things taking place in our community. And with our commitment to come together to build opportunities for all, I'm confident that the next 10 years will be very important for our community and contribute to prosperity for our community in every respect. We have a lot of things that we need to do in the next 10 years, and our plan is ambitious. But by coming together, I'm confident that we can make some real progress. Throughout our effort, we have been led by Bruce Katz. He is a very experienced, highly effective planner in connection with urban development and redevelopment. He's worked in many cities across the United States, and he has come to know a lot about the aspirations and opportunities and the challenges of our St. Louis region. Bruce has been very effective in the work that he has done so far, and I'm confident as we move to finalize our plan that we are going to be in very good shape. Bruce has also led us to appreciate that in the months ahead, there will likely be opportunities in terms of infrastructure support from the federal government. With our St. Louis 2030 jobs plan, we are going to be poised to be able to participate in federal programs that could have great consequence for the St. Louis region. Bruce, we thank you for all that you've done, and we look forward to hearing your summary of our plans so far. And thank you for participating in our program today. Bruce Katz.
Well, thanks, Mark, and thanks to Hank and the WashU family for hosting this. So many people at WashU have been central to the preparation of this plan. So I won't thank everyone who's participated, but just know that we're very grateful. So next slide as we cycle through this. So I'm going to talk a bit about the process of putting this together, the goal of our effort, and really focus in on the 5 strategies. And then we open up for questions and discussion. Also, we'll hear from some key architects of this plan and key players at WashU. Next slide. So from the very beginning, as Mark said, this is a 10-year effort. And it's focused on inclusive growth, which we'll define as we move through this, but it's also a metropolitan plan. So this is about the full metropolitan area. It doesn't cover all topics that obviously affect economic growth, but it covers very critical topics around innovation and entrepreneurship and workforce development and small business, particularly given the dynamics of the pandemic, as Mark said. Next slide. This is a metro plan. You are the 20th largest metropolitan area in the United States, which means ipso facto, you are globally significant. And you'll see why as I walk through this. But you've been stagnating economically and you've been flatlining from a population perspective. So this plan is critical to get you back on track, essentially, particularly given the shifting market dynamics of the pandemic. Next slide. Fortunately for us, you are a very well-studied metropolitan area. The Ferguson report, the Equitable Economic Development Framework that was done earlier last year, your infrastructure work, the geospatial report, excellent work has been done in this region. A lot of it has been done through community engagement. We've read all of these plans, all of these strategies, and I hope as we go through, you see them in particular initiatives and recommendations we make. Next slide. So what we did as to freshen up the metro conversation was we did a baseline analysis of your performance from a metropolitan perspective economically over the last decade. We looked at your various clusters and sectors, measured them against others in the United States, and particularly your peers. some older industrial metros, but also some high-flying metros in the heartland, so to speak, like Denver. We then use that quantitative analysis and a series of interviews to organize ourselves around 6 focus groups, which I'll describe. And we conducted many interviews, one-on-one interviews over Zoom, and people were very generous with their time and very frank with their comments, which was quite helpful. Next slide. So these are the working groups. We started with a working group on inclusive growth that was led by Michelle Tucker from the United Way, because inclusive growth is a wonderful term, but you need to define it, and you particularly need to define it in a way that's customized to different metros in the United States, which have different market performance. Then based on the quantitative analysis and our interviews, we focused on restoring the core, really the central core, and you'll see how we've mapped that out. Basically building a world-class small business ecosystem, which will be critical in the aftermath of the pandemic. Making St. Louis a talent engine, so a deep dive on talent, 10 through 12, community colleges, skills providers, 4-year universities, biosciences, which is really a calling card for this region, and then transportation, distribution, and logistics, which is a platform for so many of the industries that you have in St. Louis. So these were our working groups, and ultimately they involved dozens and dozens of stakeholders, practitioners, and experts. Next slide. The diagnostic we ran pre-COVID showed that you were slow to come out of the Great Recession, and that your growth rate compared to the nation as a whole during the bulk of the last decade, you saw a little uptick in 2016, but you were essentially growing at 1/5 of the national average. And next slide, compared to the Denvers of the world, or even peers like Kansas City and Baltimore, given your late start in growth in the last decade, you just didn't experience the same growth in not just metropolitan product, but jobs, which is really becoming a central focus of this effort. Next slide. Our dive into the clusters showed that you're in 5 traditional, what we would call advanced industry clusters. Advanced business services, you've been known as a financial services hub for a long time. Biomed and health services, again, a calling card given the deep chops that WashU and other universities and companies have. Advanced production, very eclectic manufacturing sector with a particular focus in aerospace and automotive. And then this platform of transportation, distribution, and logistics with the added kicker of Scott Air Force Base, which is basically trans-command for all the services and their logistics. But there are next generation sectors which are emerging, and we'll talk about this as we get to the strategies. Geospatial, because of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. FinTech, because of Square. Ag Tech, because of Danforth Plant Science. This is where the puck is going. And these are industries, next generation technologies, which cut across many sectors. And St. Louis has the potential not just to invent next generation technologies, but deploy them with large jobs effect. Next slide. You built a great tech startup scene last decade. A lot of this is related to what goes on in WashU, commercialization of research, the Scandalaris Center. Biogenerator at Cortex is a major intermediary. Arch grants, so some real excellent movement here that's been recognized nationally and beyond. Arch grants and Biogenerator are really global models. But next slide. As Mark was saying, your starting point on Black-owned business in particular lags other metros. You do have many Black-owned business, but they tend to be concentrated in low-wage sectors of the economy. They're undercapitalized, they're underbanked, they don't have many employees, and they didn't really participate in the federal relief efforts done through the Paycheck Protection Program. So there's a lot of work to do in this area, as there are in other cities and metros around the country. Next slide. As you begin to grapple with these opportunities and challenges, one thing we found is that This is a metro that's rich in assets, but also rich in intermediaries, universities, colleges, special entities formed to work around workforce development or small business growth. So you've got a deep bench in St. Louis, which gives you an opportunity to really move on many of these issues, but also act in unison as a collective. Next slide. One of the things that you'll see is the rationale for focusing so much on the core is that your starting point around jobs or employment density in the center city is much less, much more challenging than other average metros in the US. And most American metros, maybe 20 to 25% of the jobs in the metro are actually located within 3 miles of the central business district. It's a much lower share in St. Louis, which means you're literally missing about 130,000 jobs within that greater downtown area. And as we know from the last 25 years of research, it's very difficult to have robust and inclusive growth at the metropolitan scale if you don't have a strong core. And many of your peers, like the Denvers of the world, have succeeded because they experienced an urban rebound. So this is a critical part of the strategy going forward. Next slide. So all that leads to a focus on inclusive growth. And I'll show you the definition in a sec, but that really is the North Star. And as we move from a draft plan to final or close to final, you'll see us putting forward a few, maybe 3 goals for the region to aspire to in the next decade, and then a series of metrics or indicators to track your progress as you move forward and course correct if you need to. So next slide. So under Michelle Tucker's leadership, we created a definition of inclusive growth that we feel is customized to St. Louis. You know, when you do this work in a San Francisco or a Boston or a New York pre-COVID, and you said, we want to grow in an inclusive manner, the uniform response to that was affordable housing, first priority, second priority, third priority. In St. Louis, you have to grow quality jobs. That really is critical at the outset. And then simultaneously, you have to do that in such a way to reduce racial and spatial disparities on income, health, and wealth. So that's what inclusive growth means in St. Louis, given your starting points. Next slide. Now, if you do that, a whole bunch of really positive things happen. Your gross metro product grows substantially, but also you begin to see job growth by lifting up the potential of Black and Brown-owned business to have the same kind of startup rates and entrepreneurial success as quote-unquote majority-owned business. I mean, there's a big job effect from focusing on this area that has been neglected, not just in St. Louis, but in many cities and metros across the United States. Next slide. So here's where we ended up as a 5-strategy play. Steward an inclusive economy, and with greater STL, you'll hear from Jason Hall and Val Patton. It's critical to have that business leadership group, civic leadership group to do that. Restore the core, talked about that. I'll go into more specificity. Build this small business ecosystem. It's not just about capital products. It's not just about anchor procurement. It's not just about commercial corridors. It's about all of the above. It's an ecosystem. Become a talent engine and magnet. The #1 issue that CIOs and CTOs told us was their binding constraint on growth in St. Louis. They didn't have the talent. And finally, 21st century industries. You have them. And particularly whether it's traditional strengths or new sectors, you can become a first mover. Next slide. So on the inclusive economy, having this business leadership group, a merger of 5 organizations, is absolutely essential. Every major metro in the US has them. But what we said is there needs to be an STL pledge. Your major corps, the eds, the meds, the utilities, the feds, they need to commit to buy local, hire local, invest local, and take a portion of growing jobs and put them in the core. That's a signature effort. There's a lot of supplier diversity efforts going on around the US, particularly with universities and hospitals, but this whole package of procurement and hiring and investing and location is something that would be unique. Next slide. The core. We redefine the core to get beyond the greater downtown, move up through Harris Stowe and SLU up to Cortex, but then break the Del Mar divide, which makes absolutely no sense from an economic perspective because you've got Rankin Tech on the other side of the divide, you've got NGA, you've got Square. There's the potential to see the core of St. Louis be the home to new innovation hubs with very positive effects on hiring and business growth for residents of the city around biosciences and fintech and geospatial and advanced manufacturing. And then in particular, this effort requires new transformative placemaking, like the Brickline Greenway, and neighborhood transformation that really engages the community around redevelopment, taking account of your hyper vacancies. So this is a unique play. And other cities, can take a look at St. Louis in the next 5 or 10 years and say they're doing something different here. It's not just about population. It's about quality job growth and inclusive growth. Next slide. Small business. We're going to wake up after this pandemic, as Mark said, devastated small businesses, particularly Main Street businesses, and decimated business districts and commercial corridors. So as we think about demand for enterprises and entrepreneurs, supply STL, building off the STL pledge, a concerted, well-capitalized effort to match up the procurement from anchor institutions to Black and Brown-owned businesses. And if they don't exist, build them. A Main Street STL effort to bring together all of the commercial corridors and business districts and main streets that have been hurt, a continuum of capital for a continuum of companies and districts, and a collaborative. You've got, again, great practitioners pulling them together as the 2 + 2 = 5 effect. Next slide. Talent. This is a binding constraint, and it's not because of unemployment rates as in the past. It's because the pace of technological innovation with AI, with machine learning, means that incumbent workers need to be constantly retrained through higher education and industry collaboratives. And a system needs to be built to have a feeder system, bringing more and more of your residents in the city and the county, particularly on the north side, into the mainstream of the US economy. This can be done. It's been done in other places. And again, you've got the practitioner base to do it. So going from transactions to a system really is a unifying thread across this entire plan. Next slide. Advanced industries. Advanced industries really matter. The multiplier effect of these advanced jobs coming off, in many cases, university research is phenomenal. It's why places like Pittsburgh have rebounded in the past 15 or 20 years. Our recommendation, quadruple down on biosciences. You have a unique play. It's human health plus plant science, critical to climate change, critical to food insecurity, location science, geospatial. You could be one of the hubs in the world around this, given NGA. But you've got to commercialize the research coming out of a national intelligence entity. Advanced manufacturing, still a play for your region, particularly with reshoring. And then freight, digital access, transit, infrastructure to be in the service of this growth. Next slide. So well, I guess the comment period ended yesterday, I suppose, but this is still open. So the comments coming in, by the way, from people all over the region have been constructive. They've been detailed. And when you see the final quote unquote plan, it's never really final because it's a living document. But when you see the next iteration of this, what you'll see is our response to these comments. It's been really wonderful to see people engaged, because in the end, you don't want this just delivered from an outsider. You want this to be homegrown, co-designed, co-developed, and then implemented and delivered. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back. But thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Bruce. That's a great overview. And I'm sure that those participating in this webinar will appreciate the opportunity to interact with you and other panelists. So thank you again for the great work that you've done. And I'm looking forward to elements of implementation very, very soon. So I'll turn it now back to Executive Vice Chancellor Hank Weber to moderate the panel discussion. Hank?
Thank you very much, Mark. And I would like to ask a question or two of each of our panelists. I would again ask you to submit your questions for the last part of this in the Q&A feature. So let me begin, and I'm going to introduce each of our panelists before I ask them a question. So let me start with Jason Hall. Jason is the Chief Executive Officer of Greater St. Louis, Inc. As the implementer of this plan, Greater St. Louis, Inc. Will have a primary role. Greater St. Louis, Inc. brings together business and civic leaders to create jobs and expand economic growth and improve St. Louis's global competitiveness. Prior to joining Greater St. Louis, Inc., Jason was the CEO and co-founder of Arch to Park, a civic-minded investment organization focused on economic growth in the urban core of St. Louis. And as one who knows Jason well, I can tell you his commitment to growth and inclusion in this region could not be higher. Jason, so what role will Greater St. Louis, Inc. play in implementing this plan over the next decade?
Appreciate it, Hank, and thank you for the very kind introduction. It's great to be with the forum today. So, as I think Bruce had mentioned, one of the things actually called for in the 2030 jobs plan is the creation of a Greater St. Louis, Inc. And as you look around at best practice in the country, it is not to have fragmented groups trying to guide growth, particularly inclusive growth at a strategic level, spread across that many organizations. So the act of creating a GSL to help steward this plan is also part of the plan. You know, I like to think of the analogy, it's like an integrator of efforts. And so GSL will be quarterbacking this effort and bringing people to the table, driving accountability, driving the initiatives forward that allow us to reach our full potential and accomplish the things we're talking about in this plan over the next decade. It will not, cannot, and should not do everything, from an implementation level, but it needs to be guiding it. And we need to build bigger tables to do this in St. Louis, quite frankly. We need to be pulling up more chairs to the table to get these things done. Because at the end of the day, no one organization, as I said, cannot or should not do it all. But to convene us together, to make sure we're driving it, working across institutions, across geography, to make it happen is critical. And I think the lessons of other organizations throughout the country, if a team doesn't get up every single day figuring out how to drive that level of collaboration and coordination throughout the region, it just simply doesn't happen, or it becomes increasingly difficult to achieve the kind of results that, quite frankly, we must achieve this decade.
So one more question, Jason, just to follow up. So you're in charge of implementation. What do you see as the greatest challenge to implementation?
It's a good question. There are a lot of challenges. There's a lot of opportunities, as Bruce highlighted in the report as well. We're awash in assets and we're full of potential, but we have to be past potential to achieving the kinds of outcomes that we want. Honestly, Hank, one of the biggest challenges I think this is a new way of thinking for this region. I mean, there has been some muscle memory loss on what it takes to drive growth at a metropolitan level. We can talk about regionalism, but you have to invest in a mechanism to achieve that. And it is hard work. Collaboration is not the steady state. We have to invest in taking it. So I think there's that. But you know, we're not only are we driving the first jobs plan in a decade, driving philosophical shifts in this metro about what growth means. It means we're going to be acting to foster inclusive growth, not just growth. We're going to be talking about and driving the importance of the urban core to metropolitan growth and other conversations. These are major philosophical shifts in how this region has approached growth policy. So you've got that on top of Val and I stitching together 5 organizations to create a new one that feels like a startup on any given day. So those are all just a lot of challenges. But I'll tell you, I am struck by the enthusiasm that this community is expressing about its future. It starts with making these kinds of decisions and say, we're going to act differently. We're going to focus on a very specific agenda to drive the kind of outcomes we need, focus on the things that matter. That gives me great hope. And that's what will get us through these very challenging obstacles to implementation.
You have a demanding job, but you're clearly the right person for it. Dedric, our next speaker is Dr. Dedric Carter. Dedric serves as the Vice Chancellor for Operations and Technology and a Professor of Engineering Practice at Washington University in St. Louis. Among his many duties, and he has a very wide array of operational duty, he's responsible for our Office of Technology Management, and he also serves very recently an appointment as the president of the Missouri Technology Corporation. He has been one of the real leaders in entrepreneurship in the region. And a question I want to ask you, Dedric, is about entrepreneurship. The plan has a heavy focus on the region's entrepreneurial ecosystem. You're extensively engaged in that. How do we meet that? How do we increase entrepreneurship? We've made a lot of progress, but how do we become a national leader in this space?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. First, thank you very much for the question. It's a great opportunity to share with you guys some thoughts. You know, I believe historically there are 3 ways that you can change your station in life. You can either have inheritance and legacy, which we see a lot of, and that sort of means a prior generation attained something and they just hand it over to you. And you're the beneficiary. You can win the lottery, which is sort of your numbers up, you got lucky, or you can actually do something. And that's sort of the learning and the preparation and the action that we're talking about here in the jobs plan. And actually, I believe that the gatekeeper for the sort of doing something in new venture creation is really access. I mean, one of the things that we really do need to do in short order is cultivate an equitable environment where access is available and the infrastructure is not withheld from all. I think that in and of itself is extremely important in order to move in this new direction. If you think about entrepreneurship and its importance and why it's important in the region, we've talked about a number of those things, but it's important because it will help us to improve productivity. It'll push on the unproductive firms and help them to move in the direction to become more productive. It spurs innovation. If you think about how research is translated, Bruce talked about translating the technologies out of the geospatial world and into the everyday world in which we live. That translation generally comes from new ventures. So the proliferation of new ventures is something that we've got to start to think about. And this entrepreneurial surge, which is inclusive, is going to be key to our development as an entrepreneurial ecosystem and region. And I think lastly, if you want to really create jobs, the net new job creator in the country is new and young businesses. I mean, that being willing to take on these sort of new ventures and help them to grow. So I believe that's our opportunity, really, is removing the barriers to access.
So Dedric, if you could wave your magic wand,
Mm-hmm.
could do 1, 2, 3 things to remove those barriers to access, what would they be? Yeah. What should we rally around?
Yeah, so I think in the region, I said this a few years ago, there are 3 things we've got to do. One is, we have to sort of educate the people, secure the peace, and connect the place. In this particular context, what we've got to do is make sure that we don't put our fingers on the scale, because as more resources flood in, and there will be resources that come in to help take advantage or capitalize and leverage the assets that come out of NGA and other places. If you've got an unbalanced scale and the finger continues to be on the scale, then you just get more imbalance. We've got to find ways to make sure that we're working to openly make the access to these resources available to all. So that's most important thing, I'd say.
Thank you. Thank you, Dedrick. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Lodge. Jenny is the Vice Chancellor for Research and the David Blassingame Professor of Molecular Microbiology at the School of Medicine here at Washington University. Like Dedrick, she has received a new position recently. She is becoming a named professor. She's responsible for university-wide research operations and support infrastructure, and serves as a resource for all of us on institutional strategic planning and development. She's also been at the center of linking efforts to link companies, biotech companies, to researchers both at Washington University and SLU. Jenny, the plan rightly notes that St. Louis is a national powerhouse in bioscience research. While we've made much progress in becoming a commercial hub in these areas, we still lag behind a number of other reasons. What do we do to close that gap between our research prowess and the number of jobs and the number of companies?
So Hank, thanks very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. And I think to answer your question, I think there's a couple of different factors. There's the internal Washington University factors, and there's the external external St. Louis factors. And I think you referred to the fact that we have made a lot of progress. And I just want to start out by saying thank you to Mark Wrighton, who kind of kicked this off in 2013. Historically, we had a very conservative culture here at Washington University. We weren't very focused on translating the results of our research into the private sector. And I think Mark kicked that off in 2013, and we've really made a ton of progress. But I think we have to continue to really support, encourage, recognize, and reward our entrepreneurs. There's still a lot more work to be done in that area. And we've got, I think, some folks here at WashU who are very focused on doing that. We need to invest more in some of the infrastructure that supports entrepreneurship, and as well as develop more partnerships with existing industries. So not just building our own industry, but also partnering with existing industries and creating those partnerships in a way that works both for the industry as well as for our researchers. And there's multiple valleys of death, small valleys all along the way of creating some successful company. And even just getting it to the point of being a company. And so we need to figure out how to sort of bridge those small valleys of death. And then externally, we really want to make St. Louis an attractive place to grow startups that start here in St. Louis, but also attract biotech to the St. Louis area. And so as you think about what a biotech startup needs in order to be successful here in the St. Louis area, we need to have a laboratory and research space that is affordable for every stage of a startup, from the very beginning when it's only 1 or 2 people, all the way, and an idea, all the way up to when you've grown to 40 or 50 people and you are looking to get bought out. We really don't want to see our startups abandoning St. Louis to go to other parts of the country. So we have to make it attractive for them to stay here. And then, in order to attract other larger firms to come to St. Louis, it's the quality of our research here in St. Louis. And it's the availability of the laboratory space, it's the price of housing. And I think most importantly, it's all about a diverse, inclusive, and talented workforce. And that means everything from, people at the very sort of the very base folks who support the research all the way up to CEOs. And so I think we need a lot more training programs to get people into this field. And there, I know we've got people like Sam Fiorello at Cortex who are really committed to develop training programs and to really bring an inclusive workforce to bear on bioscience.
Thank you, Jenny, for a really complete and thoughtful answer. I must say, as some people on the panel, on the call know, I have had the privilege for the last 5 years of chairing the board of the Cortex Innovation District, which recruits companies and helps them grow. And the point you made, two of the points you made about affordable space, particularly lab space, which is very important, and about the way talent drives company decisions, I could not emphasize more. When we recruit a company, they want to know that they can find people here.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you very much. So let me turn, last but not least, of course, last member of our panel, and thank you for the questions that have come in, is Valerie Patton, who's the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Greater St. Louis, Inc., and President of the Greater St. Louis Foundation. She leads Greater St. Louis, Inc.'s diversity, equity, inclusion strategies and programs. She founded the Chamber's Business Diversity Initiative Fellows Program, a year-long leadership development experience for professionals of color, and Gateway Connection, a welcoming orientation for professionals of color. Both of these are now programs of Greater St. Louis, Inc. Valerie, if you read through Bruce's slides or the report, perhaps the single most striking figure, and not in a positive way, is that St. Louis is 50th out of the 50 largest cities in the United States in Black-owned startups and small businesses. What can we do to change that? It's very clear that if we don't change that, we're not going to achieve a lot of our other goals in this plan. So what do all of us in the region need to do?
So first, thank you, Dr. Wrighton. Thank you, Hank, for this opportunity this afternoon. As it relates to the 50 out of 50 in Black-owned and startup businesses, it's not that we don't have Black-owned businesses in our region. They tend to be organizations that don't generate wealth, employ a lot of people, and really can't make the sea change that's needed for the region. So what do we need to do? We need to have the ability for Black and brown businesses to access capital. We also need to look at putting together a capital fund that is targeted to Black and brown owned businesses. We also need to partner and collaborate. As we know, this is a region where we are very rich in assets, and some of that richness and assets comes from the fact that we don't like what somebody else is doing, so we go start our own thing. So we're going to have to do more partnering. We're going to have to do more collaborating. We're going to have more access to resources, such as technical assistance. We're going to have to be at the table, have access and at the table as it relates to emerging markets and businesses and industries in the region. So it's not going to be one thing that's going to make it all come together, but it's going to be a myriad of things that will happen, hopefully in sync, to make things a better opportunity for Black and brown owned businesses.
Valerie, for those of us who know that this is really important and want to contribute, how can we do that? And those of us who's the symphony conductor that we go to and say, we've got an idea for a piece of music, or we can play the oboe?
So one way you can do that on our website, greaterstlouisinc.com. There's a section where you can volunteer and share your wanting to participate in the activities that we'll be doing. As it relates to what you've just heard, we will be guiding and shepherding the STL pledge, which is around getting our entities to hire and buy here within the region, and also supply STL, which is really going to be encouraging us to buy local and grow our locally owned businesses that just larger scales.
Thank you, Valerie. I think you're going to have a lot of comments judging from
Yes.
on this issue. Okay, if I can ask the panelists to turn all back on their cameras for the Q&A, and I'm going to try to ask these questions, but I'll often start by asking one person, but any of the panelists can feel add-on, although probably 2 comments for each question is enough because it will give us. And the first question, which is the question I've been asked the most, and is, I want to start with Jason, is what's different this time? How do we make this in reality? A couple of comments have come in and said, we've had great plans in the past, not quite perhaps this strong a plan. I think Bruce did a remarkable job. What's different this time? How can we make this happen?
Well, I would say it's a fair question. One, you have to organize for success. I mean, we can't just say we're gonna implement plans and not invest in the civic capacity and the hard work of organizing people and capital to drive them forward. And I think if you see front and center an historic level of defragmentation to come together to create a civic vehicle for shepherding a growth plan like this, I think you're seeing action. Secondly, I would say, look, I know there have been times where plans sit on shelves, but I'd go back to St. Louis 2004, Cortex, and examples where plans didn't sit on shelves and we got huge things done. The fellows program and the SLBDI that Val founded came out of that St. Louis 2004 effort. Great Rivers Greenway, founded as a vision out of St. Louis 2004. Dedrick and I've worked together, on a vision to bring capital and make sure that the state had pro-growth, pro-entrepreneur policy. People told us it was impossible. We're making those plans happen. So some of it is an attitudinal recognition, I think, for all of us, but it requires us to get up every day, come together and say, not what can this plan do for me, but what can I do to help drive this plan forward? Because these are community plans. And so we've all got to double down on the commitment, I think, and show up in a way that can help drive them forward. Because when we have done that, we have accomplished big things. And I think it's a reminder that we need to do that. So I know Val and I look forward to stewarding that each and every day.
Any other comments from the panel? Okay, let me go to my second question. Several people in several questions came in and said, many of the regions that have made the strongest moves in recent years are regions that have regionalized their government in some way. Indianapolis, Nashville, etc. How much is our governmental structure a barrier? And what do we do about the fact that this is unlikely to happen? And Bruce, you may want to comment on this as well.
Well, I'm happy to jump in if, okay, Bruce, go ahead.
No, I think it really built on what Jason said, because I think in many of those other communities, the business and civic community really took the leadership at the metropolitan scale to design, finance, and deliver transformative investments around many of the topics that are covered in this plan. Fragmentation remains governmental fragmentation remains a central issue, not in all of those other places, but in many of them. But I think the distinctive factor of American success is how much private and civic leaders participate in economy shaping and market making. Outside the US, a lot of this is left to the government. Inside the US, what we see is this healthy role that corporations, eds and meds, and philanthropies play. And I think that's really the promise of Greater STL Inc. is to adapt to St. Louis the successes from many of these other communities.
I want to add, Hank, just because I think this is important, because this is, it's sort of like the knee-jerk reaction sometimes of, plans sitting on shelves and are we doing enough? Social change takes a while. These do not happen in days and months. It happens in years and decades. And if you look at Pittsburgh, for example, which has got as much fragmented municipal government, I think it's second to St. Louis. They merged their economic development organizations decades ago and have been driving and fostering growth across those lines. But it's going to take work. And I'll tell you, I spoke to the Municipal League late one evening last week. There was no resistance to doing this. I think there were some questions about what's the role of the core and its relationship versus other parts of the metro. Those are fair questions because we haven't done as much education on that work. I've also reached out and have been engaging directly one-on-one with all 15 of the principal elected officials from the bi-state metropolitan region. Many of them saying, first time I've been called. So if we want collaboration and want to not make excuses about government, but trying to make it work, then we're going to have to invest time and energy and effort to do that. It doesn't just happen automatically. It requires relationship building and communication. And we're trying to lead like that, even in the first 30 days of GSL.
Thank you both. So Bruce, Dedrick, Jenny, all talked about talent and all talked about the pipeline and all talked about how that's essential for success and essential for equity in the region. Number of questions came in supporting that notion, but saying you have to do things about schools and in particular in St. Louis schools to be able to do that. This may be a jobs plan, but if the educational system isn't producing workers at every level who can do jobs, we're not going to be successful. Thoughts on this? Comments on this? Jenny, Dedrick first, or anyone?
I'll just say that I think that is absolutely critical. Kids start thinking about what they want to be when they grow up and envisioning themselves, when they're in 4th, 5th, 6th grade. You can't wait until they're 18 or 21 in order to get them excited about doing something entrepreneurial, or in my case, what I'm so passionate about in bioscience. You have to catch them early. You have to give them a quality education.
I'll jump in and say I 100% agree. I think educating, providing quality education, and really securing the peace are two critical infrastructure elements that have to be present for any ecosystem to be mature and vibrant. And if you think about, we've heard lots in the last couple of months about companies. I'm thinking from an entrepreneurial lens, companies leaving one area, Silicon Valley or the East Coast, and finding other places. And that's true. And there is absolutely a level setting that happens here. It's akin to the development of the transistor in the 1940s, late 1940s, where old firms said we're going to stick around with this big vacuum tubes, and smaller firms like Texas Instruments said there's a whole new ballgame. And that playing field said the rules are rewritten. If we can think about quality of life, inclusion, and equity, and securing the peace, and what virtual adjacency means to connect the place with good quality education, that's what's going to attract and retain people who want to be entrepreneurial, and that's going to be critical to the region. So I fundamentally believe that we have to pay attention to those things.
Yeah, Hank, I would just say successful cities and metros have to walk and chew gum at the same time. And I work at Drexel University. Philadelphia is, if not the highest poverty major city in the United States, right next to Detroit. But we have very successful skills initiatives that connect folks coming out of the poorest neighborhoods in the city with good jobs, quality jobs, with ladders of opportunity in our eds and meds and public sector and beyond. The West Philadelphia Skills Initiative, that could be replicated, scaled, improved at Cortex and elsewhere. And so I think we got to move on both tracks. I mean, we've got to deal with everything that has to be done on school reform. But let's not let that stop us get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of low-income residents into quality jobs through these specialized, customized skills efforts. And I think that's what this plan tries to do. It says there are things we could do right now that could begin to reduce racial disparities on income and with the support of key institutions.
Thank you for those comments. I should note that on the feedback side of this session, the comment about the importance of public schools, particularly in the city, is as essential to this success of this has been the comment that the unscientific Q&A response that I have received has been the single most common. The second most common question in varieties of ways in the Q&A is how do we make sure that this plan reaches our areas of greatest poverty? That the plan takes a regional perspective, which I think all of us appreciate. It notes the strengths of the core and expands it north, which is a very good thing. But how do we make sure, and we have several comments in the chat, how do we make sure that this directly benefits the areas in our region of extraordinarily deep poverty in North St. Louis City, in East St. Louis, and unfortunately growing in some St. Louis suburbs? And that will be my last question on time.
Thank you for that question. And we have been very intentional of making sure that we hear the voices of all of those people and all of those communities. Also, as we look at expansion, you look at NGA. NGA borders one of the poorest zip codes in the region. So making sure that we get them included in education around location services, getting them exposed, letting them know what is available to them, it bordering one of the poorest zip codes. As we know, the tide is going to rise. So there will be people that will be coming into the community. There will be a need for the schools and curriculums to change and be improved. All of that will happen as we begin to move into neighborhoods, just no different than the Delmar Divine project, where it borders some disinvested, disenfranchised neighborhoods. But what will happen in that development will help all as we rise that tide. So we made sure that are listening to the Black startup entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs, residents, folks that are working in industry. I saw something in the Q&A around justice involved. We have all of those pieces working, very much talking to the folks that authored the Forward to Ferguson report, making sure that we will be incorporating some of those key elements there, especially around economic mobility, job skills, employment, entrepreneurship. So we reached out to many and continue to reach out to many, but this is also a two-way street. If we miss somebody or you don't think your voice has been heard, we need to hear from you.
So with that, and I'd like to thank Bruce, Mark, the panelists. And I'd like to conclude with what I think is a summary of the comments I've gotten in the Q&A, which is, this is a very good plan. We all would do it perhaps a little bit differently here and there, but you've really given us the inspiration for what we have to do going forward. The challenge for the region, and it's really got to be done by all of us on this call, is the perspiration of making change. And undoubtedly some of the strategies will work better than others. We undoubtedly will have to make adjustments, But the job for the region is to say, we care about inclusive growth. It's not okay to be 50th out of 50. We have an opportunity to be national leaders, and we have to do that. And that's the challenge. So with that, I'd like to thank you all. I'm committing to being part of the perspiration, and it will take a while, but we can also make great progress. Thank you all.
Thank you.